Hello, I'm Michael Peters, and this is What You Need to Know About Social Psychology. In talking about social psychology, the first thing we have to stress is what's called social cognition, and that's one's ability to understand and predict other people's behavior, and our own. Because a lot of what we do in social situations is implicit, which means we don't really know what's going on. And there's probably reasons why we don't know what's going on, and we'll get to them. But ensuring that we are part of a group, evolutionarily, has benefits. Because if we're part of a group, it means we're probably going to eat. If we're alone, we don't have teeth, we don't have claws for killing animals, we have to rely on each other. And it's beneficial to be with some other people if you have to go out and find food. Because there's things that we can do as a group that we can do better than when we're alone. This is called social facilitation. That's when there's a tendency to perform tasks better in the presence of others. On the other hand, there's social inhibition. That's a tendency to perform tasks more poorly when in groups. For example, if the group gets distracted easily, it's going to be hard to find food. Then, there's also social loafing, and that's a tendency to let others in a group do the work. For example, if you've ever had to do a project, and someone just really wants to do it their way, and you're like, okay, go ahead. Essentially, that's social loafing. Problems with being in a group, well, they could be pros and they could be cons, but one of the things that happens is called groupthink, and that's when you're in the presence of others who have similar ideas, thinking becomes radicalized, pushed into the extremes. For example, at Democratic or Republican conventions, people think the same thing, they're more likely to voice those opinions, and when voicing opinions, perhaps people who have more radical opinions voice those opinions, moving the entire group to a more radical line of thought, one way or the other. And because these homogenous groups, people who tend to think alike, tend to go towards extremes, there's also poor choice making. For example, if you've got a bunch of teenagers with no parents around, they might make some poor choices that they wouldn't make if there were, say, for example, one adult in the room. They might talk about things that they might not talk about if there was one adult in the room. And groups who share similar ideas tend to believe in the morality of the group, a morality that they might not believe, or at least not say out loud, if there was someone who's not in the group present. So what makes groups willing to accept us into their social situations? And the first is, each of these groups have a set of social norms. They're accepted beliefs of what we should or should not do as part of that group. And if we violate these norms, there's going to be problems. You're probably going to be exiled from that group. And in a lot of cases, this is also called bullying or excommunication. For example, if you're playing in a park and a dog comes by and someone kicks the dog, there's going to be consequences for kicking the dog. So we tend not to do that. We tend not to do things that are socially unacceptable in groups because we don't want to be exiled from the group. For an example of social norms, let's say people are playing a football game and one person, not knowing the norm, takes the ball and goes home. That's probably going to keep them from being invited into the group next time. And when we're part of the group, or part of the team, we have a social identity with that team. And that's the emotions we experience from being in that group. For example, facial recognition is based in the amygdala. And the amygdala is what's responsible for our emotion sense. So every time we recognize someone, recognize their face, we get a little emotional charge from the amygdala, and also a little bit of dopamine to go along with the behavioral reward to identify this person as someone we want to hang around with. So what gives us that emotional charge? What do we find attractive in people to want them around us? Well, the research on this says that we find average people most attractive. For example, if I was going to ask you, what do you find more attractive? Someone who's beautiful or someone who's average? You might say beautiful, you might say average. But the research shows that the average face is going to be more attractive than the beautiful face. And the reason behind this has a lot to do with perfect people tend to make us feel bad. So what we're looking for is someone who's really attractive, but with one major flaw. And the best example, I think, of this would be Marilyn Monroe. Beautiful face, one little mole. I'm not sure exactly where it was, or, they make fun of it and say it's moved around, but there's one little flaw. That way the person doesn't appear to be perfect. There's a flaw and something we can recognize immediately. Because the faster we recognize someone, the faster we get that little bit of dopamine and that emotional charge. So we're looking for someone who's average, but that we can identify relatively quickly. So if I ask you what's more attractive, someone who's got a symmetrical face or someone who's asymmetrical, the answer is probably going to be the symmetrical person, because evolutionarily speaking, someone who has uneven eyes or is an unsymmetrical face, that tended to be a sign of a parasite. But then after we identify who's attractive, so how do we form close relationships with those people? Ideally, someone with a close relationship is someone you have communication with, and that communication is a key toward reaching some goal that you could not reach yourself. Self-disclosure is a good way to communicate, but you have to be careful that the self-disclosure isn't one-sided. Then we have the effect of proximity, because it turns out just being around something for a period of time makes that thing or person more likable, more relatable. Because when you recognize something, there is that emotional charge, that hit of dopamine that makes you feel better, even if it's something you really don't like. And lastly, research has shown us that a great indicator of a close relationship is having a superordinate goal. Having a goal that one person can't do alone. For example, raising children. Very difficult to do alone, but if you have someone to help you, that makes it easier. And just having someone there to help you means that there's going to be a closer and building relationship between those two people. But there are positive and negative aspects to being part of a group. For example, if you are part of a group, you're more likely to be stereotyped, which is the tendency to attribute characteristics based upon the appearance or traits of that group. For example, if you're a Lions fan, that tells something about you. If you're a Patriots fan, that tells something about you. And if you're a Broncos fan, that tells something about you, about how you feel about the Patriots. Are you being stereotyped? Yes. And we have to make these snap judgments just so that we're not stuck in social situations trying to reason everything out. And these shortcuts are called heuristics. They're little shortcuts for making thinking go faster because our brains are relatively slow, but within these generalizations, there does tend to be mistakes.